History of the Vandal Persecution in Africa by Victor Vitensis. Translated by John Moorhead and published in the Liverpool University Press, 1992. Book 1. It's evident that this now is the 60th year since the cruel and savage people of the Vandal race set foot on the territory of wretched Africa. They made an easy passage across the straits because the vast and broad sea becomes narrow between Spain and Africa, which are separated by only 12 miles. A large number made the crossing, and in his cunning, Duke Geisiric, intending to make the reputation of his people a source of dread, ordered then and there the entire crowd was to be counted, even those who had come from the womb into the light that very day, including old men, young men, and children, slaves and masters. There was found to be a total of 80,000. News of this had spread widely. Until today, those ignorant of the matter think that this is the number of their armed men, although now their number is small and feeble. Finding a province which was at peace and enjoying quiet, the whole land beautiful and flowering on all sides, they set to work on it with their wicked forces, laying it waste by devastation and bringing everything to ruin with fire and murders. They did not even spare the fruit-bearing orchards, in case people who had hidden in the caves of the mountains, or steep places, or any remote areas, would be able to eat the foods produced by them after they had passed. So it was that no place remained safe from being contaminated by them, as they raged with great cruelty, unchanging and relentless. In particular, they gave vent to their wicked ferocity with great strength against the churches and basilicas of the saints, cemeteries, and monasteries, so that they burned houses of prayer with fires greater than those they used against the cities and all the towns. When they happened to find the doors of a sacred building closed, they were keen to open up a way with the blows of their hatchets, so that of them it could then rightly be said, they broke its doors in pieces with their axes as if they were in a forest of trees. They cast it down with axe and hatchet. They set your sanctuary on fire. They cast the tabernacle of your name to the ground and defiled it. How many were the distinguished bishops and noble priests put to death by them at the time with different kinds of torments, as they tried to make them give up any gold or silver belonging to themselves or to the churches, and so that the things which were in their keeping would be brought forth more easily under the pressure of pain. They inflicted cruel torments a second time on those who produced things, asserting that they had produced a part, but not the whole, and the more a person gave, the more they believed he had still more. Some had their mouths forced open with poles and stakes, and disgusting filth was put into their jaws so that they would tell the truth about their money. They tortured others by twisting cords around their foreheads and shins until they snapped. Devoid of mercy, they offered many people seawater, others vinegar, the lees of olive oil, fish sauce, and many other cruel things, while full wineskins were placed near their mouths. Neither the weaker sex, nor regard for nobility, nor reverence for the priesthood softened those cruel hearts. On the contrary, when they caught sight of some office-holder worthy of honor, the wrath of their fury was thereupon increased. I am unable to recount the number of the priests and men holding the rank of illustris, on whom they placed enormous burdens, as if they were camels or other kinds of baggage animals, and forced to walk using iron goads. Some of them breathed their last in wretched fashion under their burdens. Mature age and that greyness worthy of veneration, which whitens the hair of the head so that it looks like a shining wool, obtained no mercy from the enemy. Indeed, in their barbaric frenzy they even snatched children from their mothers' breasts and dashed the guiltless infants to the ground. They held others by the feet upside down and cut them in two from their bottoms to the tops of their heads. Then it was, perchance, that captive Zion sang, "My enemy said that he would burn my lands, kill my little children, and dash my infants to the ground." In some buildings, namely great houses and homes, where fire had been of less service to them, they smashed the roofs in pieces and leveled the beautiful walls to the ground, so that the former beauty of the towns cannot be deduced from what they look like now. And there are very many cities with few or no inhabitants, for after these events, the ones which survive lie desolate. For example, here at Carthage, they utterly destroyed the Odeon, the theatre, the temple of Memoria, and what people used to call the Via Caelestis. To speak only of the most noteworthy things, in their tyrannical presumption they delivered over to their religion the Basilica of the Ancestors, where the bodies of Saint Perpetua and Felicitas are buried, the Basilica of Celerina and the Sciletani, and others which they had not destroyed. But where there were some defensive works against which the hostility of their barbaric frenzy was unable to prevail, countless throngs were brought together at the walls of the town. These they put to death with their savage swords, so that when the corpses had rotted away, they were able, by means of the stench of the decaying bodies, to bring about the death of those whom they had not been able to approach because of the sheltering walls which protected them. Who will be able to declare how many and how numerous were the bishops who were then tortured by them? For it was then as well that Pampinianus, the venerable bishop of our town, was burnt all over his body by plates of glowing iron. In the same way, Mansutus of Urusi was burned in the Porta Fornitana. At this time, the city of Hippo Regius, which the blessed Augustine, worthy of all praise, governed at his pontiff, was besieged. Then that river of eloquence, which flowed richly over all the fields of the church, dried up in the midst of its course, and the pleasant sweetness, so sweetly provided, was turned to bitter absinthe in accordance with the cry of David. When the sinner stood against me, I became dumb and was abased, and kept silent even from good. Until that time, he had written 232 books, not including his letters, which are beyond counting, his exposition of the entire Psalter, and the Gospels, and his sermons to the people which the Greeks call homilies, the number of which is quite impossible to establish. Why say many things? After these wild and frenzied acts of wickedness, Geisiric gained and entered Carthage, that great city, and reduced to slavery its old class of free men, free-born and noble, for his captives included not a few of the senators of the city. He thereupon published a decree that each person was to bring forward whatever gold, silver, gems, and items of costly clothing they had. And so, in a short time, the greedy man was able, by means of this device, to carry away property which had been handed down from the fathers and grandfathers. He also made an arrangement concerning the individual provinces. Byzacina, Aberitana, and Gaetulia, and part of Numidia he kept for himself. Zegutana and the proconsular province he divided up as allotted portion for his people. And he allowed Valentinian, who was still emperor, to take for himself the remaining and now devastated provinces. After Valentinian died, he gained control of the coastline of all Africa, and with his customary arrogance he also took the large islands of Sardinia, Sicily, Corsica, Ibiza, Majorca, and Minorca, as well as many others. One of these, namely Sicily, he later conceded to Odoacer, the king of Italy, by tributary right. At fixed times Odoacer paid tribute to the Vandals, as to his lords. Nevertheless, they kept back some part of the island for themselves. Moreover, Geisiric was by no means slow to enjoin the Vandals to put bishops and noble laity to flight from their churches and residences completely naked. And if they were slow to leave when given the choice, they were to stay behind as perpetual slaves. This is something which happened to many people, for we know of many bishops and laity, clari and honorati, who are slaves of the Vandals. But then he ordered that the bishop of the aforementioned city, that is Carthage, a person well known to God and man, whose name was called Voltaeus, and a great throng of the clergy were to be placed naked on dangerous ships. Having been despoiled, they were to be driven away. In his merciful goodness, the Lord graciously brought them to Naples, a town in Campania, after a safe passage. Geisiric badly treated a great number of senators and honorati, cruelly exiling them in the first place, and subsequently driving them to lands beyond the sea. When the bishop had been driven out, together with the venerable clergy, as we said above, He immediately delivered a church called Restituta, in which the bishops had always had their throne, over to his own religion, and he carried away all the churches which were inside the walls of the town, together with their wealth. But he also seized whatever churches he wanted to outside the walls, in particular 2 unusual and spacious ones dedicated to the holy martyr Cyprian, one where he shed his blood, and the other where his body is buried, at a place called Mapalia. But who could put up with this, and be able to recall it without tears? He ordered that the bodies of our dead were to be taken for burial in silence, without solemn hymns. More was to follow. The part of the clergy which still remained was also driven into penal exile. While these things were going on, the remaining bishops and distinguished men of the provinces we have mentioned as having been divided up among the Vandals, decided they would approach the king to implore his favor. When, in accordance with his custom, he had gone away to the shore of Maxula, which is commonly called Ligula, these people were seen coming to beseech him that, the churches and goods having been already lost, he gave the people of God some comfort by allowing them, at any rate, the right to reside where the Vandals now held power. It is established that the man replied to them through a messenger, with insane words, quote, I decreed that no one of your reputation and birth was to be allowed to remain here, and you dare to ask for such things? He even wanted to have them plunged into the nearby sea, then and there, but his followers kept on asking him for quite some time not to do this. They went away, consumed with sorrow and grief, and began to celebrate the divine mysteries in ways open to them, and places where it was possible, their churches having been taken away. Thereafter, as the kingdom grew in wealth, the king's pride began to grow as well, and to increase. I shall mention something which happened at this time. There was a Count, Sebastian, subtle in council and valiant in war, son-in-law of the well-known Count Bonifacius. Geisiric, just as he deemed his counsels necessary, dreaded being in his presence. He longed to put an end to him, and found a pretext for killing him in religion. The king decided to address Sebastian while his bishops and household officers were present. Sebastian, he said, I know that you have sworn to support us faithfully, and your toils and diligence show that your oath was true. But, so that your friendship may always remain linked with us and constant, I have resolved in the presence of our bishops that you are to become a follower of the religion which we and our people venerate. Sebastian devised something wonderful which would be useful for many people. He gave a wise reply in accordance with the circumstances. Quote, Lord King, I beg that a loaf of the finest white bread be brought now. Geisiric, unaware of the victory Sebastian was to win, straightway ordered that it be brought. Sebastian took the fine white bread and said, To become so splendid and something considered suitable for the king's table, this bread, after the worthless bran was shaken from the heap of fine wheat flour, was sprinkled and passed through water and fire. For this reason it is considered fair to look at and pleasant to eat. In the same way, I, ground in the mill of the Catholic mother and cleansed like pure flour through the sieve of examination, was moistened by the water of baptism and cooked by the fire of the Holy Spirit, and through the agency of the divine sacraments, God brought it about that I rose from the font pure, just like this bread from the oven. But if it please you, let what I suggest be done. Let this bread be broken in pieces, moistened with water, and made wet a second time. Let it be put in the oven. If it comes out better, I shall do as you suggest. Geisiric, when he and all those present had heard his proposal, was so entangled that it would have been impossible for him to have freed himself. Afterwards, on some other grounds, he had the warlike man put to death. But let us return to the point from which we digressed. By his deadly commands, he caused terror, so that in the midst of the Vandals our people were quite unable to breathe. No place for praying or offering the sacrifice was conceded to these people in their grief, so that there was, openly fulfilled, the prediction of the prophet. In this time there is no prince or prophet or leader, nor a place to sacrifice to your name. for every day saw fresh pieces of trickery which also affected those bishops who dwelt in regions which paid tribute to the palace. If perchance someone, as is the custom in sermons to the people of God, had named Pharaoh, Nabuchodonosor, Holofernes, or someone similar, they accused him of having said such things against the person of the king, and immediately drove him into exile. For this was the nature of the persecution being waged, here openly and there covertly. Their aim in using such pieces of trickery was to cause the name of the pious to perish utterly. I knew many of the bishops who were banished for this reason, such as Urbanus of Gerba, Crescens, the metropolitan of the town of Aquitana, who presided over 120 bishops, Habiteum of Theodalis, Elstratius of Suphis, and 2 bishops from Tripolitania, Vicus of Sabrata, and Cresconius of Oea, and also Felix the bishop of the town of Hadrumentum, who had received a certain John, a monk, from overseas. But there were also many others, of whom it would take a long time to tell. Nevertheless, when those who had been placed in exile died, others were not permitted to be ordained for the towns. Despite this, in the midst of these things, the people of God remained steadfast in the faith, and, like a swarm of bees building dwellings of wax, it was strengthened as it grew with the honeyed pebbles of faith, so that there might be fulfilled that text, "The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew in strength." After these things had taken place, the supplication of the Emperor Valentinian brought it about that, after the long silence of desolation, a bishop named Deogratius was ordained for the church at Carthage. If anyone tried to itemize what the Lord did through him, he would run out of words before he could explain anything. But after he had been made bishop, because of our sins, it came to pass that Geisiric, in the 15th year of his reign, seized Rome, the city until then most noble and renowned. At that time he took into captivity the wealth of many kings as well as people. When the throng of captives reached the shore of Africa, the Vandals and Moors divided the huge mass of people into groups. Husbands were separated from the wives, and children from the parents, in accordance with the custom of barbarians. That beloved man who was filled with God busied himself immediately. He sold all the gold and silver vessels used in worship and freed the freeborn people from being slaves of the barbarians, so that the spouses would remain together, and children be returned to their parents. And because there were no places large enough to hold such a throng, he set aside the 2 sizable basilicas we have, named that of Faustus and that of the Novi, with beds and straw, deciding each day how much it was proper for each person to receive. Because most of them had been weakened by sailing, an experience with which they were unfamiliar, and by the harshness of their captivity, there was no small number of sick people among them. That blessed bishop acted like a good nurse. He continually went round about with the doctors, and food was brought behind him, so that when each person's pulse had been taken, that person might be given what was needed in his presence. He did not even rest from his merciful work in the hours of night, but he went on, hurrying from bed to bed, inquiring as to how each was doing. So it was that he took on himself every burden, sparing neither his weary limbs nor his decayed old age. The Arians, inflamed by spite at this, used many tricks and frequently attempted to kill him. I believe that the Lord in his foresight wished to free his sparrow from the hands of those hawks quickly. The captives brought from Rome bewailed his death. For this reason, when he went to heaven, they thought that they would be delivered into the hands of the barbarians. He had carried out the duties of bishop for 3 years. Moved by their love and desire for him, the people would have snatched the limbs of the worthy body, had he not been buried when he died, and had not the multitude been kept in ignorance in accordance with the wise advice. One should never remain silent concerning the wicked things done by the heretics, and there can be nothing shameful in something which contributes to the praise of one who suffers. So, one of those who had ordained the above-mentioned bishop, whose name was Thomas, was quite often harassed by the various plots. One day, in full view of everyone, they flogged the venerable old man. But he, considering that it was not a cause for shame, but the price of his glory, rejoiced in the Lord. So it came about that after the death of the bishop of Carthage, they forbade the ordination of bishops for Zegutana and the proconsular province. There used to be 164 of them. But little by little this number has diminished, and now they seem to number just 3, if indeed these survive. Vincent of Ziga, Paul of Senari, truly a Paul in merit as well as name, and one other, Quintianus, who fled persecution and now lives as a foreigner at Edessa, a town in Macedonia. But it is clear that there were also a great many martyrdoms and a huge and numerous throng of confessors. I shall try to tell a few things about them. There were, at the time, some slaves who belonged to a certain Vandal, one of the Vandals called Millenari, Martinianus, Saturianus, and their 2 brothers, as well as a fellow slave, a noteworthy handmaid of Christ called Maxima, who was beautiful in both body and heart. And because Martinianus was the one who made his weapons, and always held in high regard by his lord, while Maxima was his mistress over the entire household, the Vandal thought he would unite Martinianus and Maxima in marriage, in order to make those members of his household more faithful to himself. Martinianus, in the way of young men of this world, wanted to be married, but Maxima, who was already dedicated to God, had no desire for a human marriage. When they came to approach the quiet privacy of the bedroom, and Martinianus, ignorant of what God had decreed for him, desired with the boldness of a husband to lie with her as with a wife, the above-mentioned handmaid of Christ replied to him in a lively voice, "O brother Martinianus, I have dedicated the limbs of my body to Christ, and as there is a heavenly and true being to whom I am already betrothed, I cannot enter into a human marriage. But I shall give you some advice, if you want to. You as well will be able to gain him, while it is allowed, so that you too may have the delight of serving the one of whom I long to marry." So, by the Lord's doing, it came to pass that the young man was obedient to the Virgin, and he too profited his soul. While the Vandal remained ignorant of the spiritual secret they shared, Martinianus, feeling compunction and now a changed man, persuaded his brothers that, inasmuch as they were brothers, they should possess in common the treasure which he had found. And so, after his conversion, he and his 3 brothers, accompanied by the Maiden of God, secretly went forth by night to join the monastery of Tabraca, over which that noble shepherd Andreas then presided. She went to live in a convent of maidens not far away. The barbarian began to carry out an investigation. He made inquiries and distributed numerous gifts, and what had happened could not be hidden. So it was that, discovering them to be not his slaves, but those of Christ, he threw the servants of God in chains and inflicted various torments on them, his purpose being not so much to make them have intercourse, but something worse, to make them defile the ornaments of their faith through the filth of rebaptism. This came to the notice of Geisiric. The king decreed that the implacable master was to keep afflicting his slaves for as long as it took for them to yield to his will. He ordered the strong cudgels were to be made which had jagged edges like palm branches, in the manner of saws. As these beat upon their backs, they would not only break their bones, but, as the spikes bore through them, would remain inside them. As their flesh was torn in pieces, the blood poured out and their inner parts were exposed to view. But on each occasion, as Christ healed them, they were restored unharmed on the next day. This happened quite often, over a long period, and no traces of their wounds were to be seen, the Holy Spirit curing them immediately. After this, a harsh imprisonment was imposed on Maxima, and she was cruelly stretched out on a spear. The throng of the servants of God who had been visiting her was still there, and, as everyone looked on, the putrefaction caused by the enormous pieces of wood vanished. The voices of all made this miracle known, and the man responsible for her custody testified to me on oath that this is what happened. But when the Vandal refused to recognize divine power, avenging grace began to operate in his house. He and his children died at the same time, and the best from among his household and his animals perished as well. The lady of the house was therefore left a widow, bereft of her husband, children, and fortune, and she offered the servants of Christ as a gift to a relative of the king, Sir Sal. The latter received the people offered to him with joy, but a demon began to trouble his children and the members of his household severely with various disturbances on account of the holy ones. In turn, his relative reported to the king what had happened. Immediately the king decreed that they were to be sent to a king of the Moors, a pagan who bore the name Capser. So it was that they were banished. But he freed Maxima, the handmaid of Christ who had put him to shame and overcome him, to do as she wished. She lives on, a virgin and the mother of many virgins of God, and is by no means unknown to me. The others arrived and were handed over to the king of the Moors we have just mentioned, who was living in a part of the desert called Capra Picta. The disciples of Christ, seeing the many forbidden and sacrilegious sacrifices carried out by the pagans, began by their preaching and way of life to invite them to the knowledge of the Lord our God, and by this means they gained an enormous multitude of pagan barbarians for the Lord Christ, in a place where the fame of the Christian name had hitherto been spread by no one. Then they gave thought as to what should be done, so that the field, which had now been cultivated and cleared of grass by the plowshare of preaching, might receive the seed of the gospel and be watered by the rain of holy baptism. They sent messengers across the long roads of the desert. At last they came to a Roman town, and the bishop was asked to send a priest and junior clergy to the believing people. The pontiff fulfilled their request with joy. A church of God was built, a great throng of barbarians were baptized altogether, and from those who had been wolves an abundant flock of lambs was multiplied. Capser sent a report of this to Geisiric. His ill will was aroused, and he ordered that the servants of God were to have their feet bound behind the backs of 4 running horses and perish together in the thorny places of the woods, the bodies of those innocent ones, as they were dragged to and fro, being cut to pieces by the spikes of the thorn bushes in the woods. He also ordered that they were to watch each other's death, one after the other. When in turn they caught sight of each other, the unbroken horses running nearby as the Moors beat them, each one, in his difficult situation as the horses sped, said farewell in this fashion. Quote, "Brother, pray for me. God has fulfilled our desire. This is the means by which the kingdom of heaven is reached." End quote. And so they sent forth their devout souls with prayer and psalms, as the angels rejoiced. Until this day, our Lord Jesus Christ has not ceased to work mighty wonders there, for the blessed Faustus, a former bishop of Bruni, testified to me that a blind woman received her sight there in his presence. After these happenings, Geisiric was inflamed against the Church of God. He sent one Proculus to the province of Zergutana to force the priests of the Lord to hand over the objects used in divine service and all the books. First, the crafty foe took away their arms, so that when they were defenseless, he would be able to capture them more easily. When they cried out that they would not hand these over, they took everything away with their greedy hands and from the altar cloths. What wickedness! They made shirts and breeches for themselves. But Proculus, who carried this out, chewed up his tongue into little pieces, and after a short time had passed, suffered a most shameful death. Then an order was given that the holy Valerian, a bishop of the town of Abenza, who had struggled manfully so as not to hand over the things of God, was to be driven outside the town by himself, and it was decreed that no one was to allow him to live in either a house or a field, for as long as he lay on a public road in the open air. He was more than 80 years old, and despite my unworthiness, I was privileged to be able to pay my respects to him while he was undergoing such an exile. At one time, when the solemnity of Easter was being celebrated, the Arians learned that our people had opened a church which had been shut at a certain place called Regia, so they could celebrate Easter Day. Straight away, one of their priests, whose name was Anduit, got together a band of armed men and incited them to attack the throng of the innocent. They went in with swords drawn, they snatched arms, others climbed onto roofs and fired arrows through the windows of the church. Just then, as the people of God were listening and singing, a lector was standing on the platform chanting the Alleluia. At that moment he was struck by an arrow in the throat. The book fell from his hand, and he himself fell backwards, dead. It is known that many others were killed by arrows and javelins right in front of the altar, and those who were not slain by the sword received harsh treatment at the king's command, and were nearly all put to death, especially those who were older. For elsewhere, as happened at Tunuzuda, Gallis, Vicus Ammoni, and some other places, at the time when the sacraments were offered to the people of God, they went in wildly, scattered the body and blood of Christ on the floor, and stamped on it with their filthy feet. At the time, Geisiric, urged on by his bishops, decreed that only Arians were to be placed in the various offices within his and his son's court. This was the experience which then befell our Armogastes, among others. Over a long period, they frequently bound around his shins strings which made a jangling noise, and they ripped into his forehead, on which Christ had fixed the standard of his cross, so that it looked wrinkled, or rather plowed, while they made noises as if they were animals. But as the holy man looked towards heaven, the strings were broken, as if they were the thread of spider webs. When the torturers saw that the strings which had bound him were broken, they kept on bringing stronger strings and pieces of hemp. But he simply invoked the name of Christ, and they were all as nothing. Moreover, while he was made to hang with his head downwards, supported by one foot, everyone saw him sleeping as if he were on a feather bed. The punishments had not been severe enough, and the king's son, Theodoric, who was his lord, ordered that he be beheaded. But he was restrained by his priest Eucundus, who said to him, "You have the power to kill him with torments of different kinds, but if you slay him with the sword, the Romans will begin to preach that he is a martyr." Then Theodoric condemned him to digging ditches for vines in the province of Bycina. Afterwards, as if to his greater shame, he ordered that he was to be a cowherd not far from Carthage, where he would be seen by everyone. In the midst of these things, Armogastes perceived, by a revelation from the Lord, that the day of his falling sleep was at hand. He summoned Felix, a Christian worthy of reverence, the superintendent of the household of the king's son, and a man who venerated him as if he were an apostle, and said to him, "The time of my death is near. Of your kindness I entreat you, by the faith we both hold, to bury me under this carob tree. If you do not do this, you will render an account to our Lord." This was not because he cared where or how his body was buried, but so that what God had revealed to his servant might be made manifest. Felix answered and said, "Far be this from us, venerable confessor. I shall bury you in one of the basilicas in triumph, and with the thanksgiving which you deserve." The blessed Armogastes replied, "No, do as I have said." Fearing to make the man of God sad, he promised that what he had ordered would, in truth, be done. Very shortly, within a few days, he departed this life, accompanied by a good confession. Felix hastened to give him the burial he had commanded under the tree. The intertwined roots and the hardness of the dry soil slowed him down, and he found the work painful, so that the burial of the limbs of the holy body proceeded rather slowly. Finally, when the roots had been cut back, they dug into the earth much more deeply and caught sight of a sarcophagus, already and made of most splendid marble, such as perhaps none of the kings had had. And I must not pass over a chief pantomime named Mascula. He was harassed with many cunning traps to make him abandon the Catholic faith, and later the king himself invited him to do this, coaxing him with worldly speech. He promised that great wealth would be heaped upon him, if he were to give a favorable hearing to what he wanted. But when he had remained strong and unconquered in the faith, the king ordered that he was to undergo capital punishment. Nevertheless, in his cunning way, he secretly enjoined that if, at that time, Mascula was frightened by the blow of the quivering sword, he was to be killed, so that he would not be turned into a glorious martyr. If, on the other hand, he remained strong in his confession, the sword was not to be used. But with Christ giving him strength, he was made strong, like a column which could not be moved, and came back a glorious confessor. Even if the envious enemy refused to make him a martyr, nevertheless, he was not able to inflict injury on our confessor. We know of another man at the time, whose name was Saturus, a shining member of the Church of Christ. With Catholic freedom, he often reproved the Arians for their perversity. He was the superintendent of the household of Honoric. Saturus was cited on the complaint of one Merivadus, a deacon whom the wretched Honoric held in signal honor, and it was decided that he was to become an Arian. Honors and wealth in abundance were promised if he did this. Dire punishments were to be prepared if he refused. This was the choice placed before him. If he did not obey the king's commands, an examination was to be conducted. First of all, he would lose his house and wealth, and all his slaves and children would be sold. Then, while he was present, his wife would be given in marriage to a camel driver. But he, filled with God, provoked those wicked people so that things would be set in a train more quickly. For this reason, his wife, without the knowledge of her husband, thought she would seek some delay from those who were acting in the matter. Another Eve, directed by the counsel of the serpent, she came to her husband. But he was no Adam who would touch the alluring fruit of the forbidden tree, because his name was not Needy, but Saturus, having been saturated by the riches of the household of God, and having drunk from the torrent of his delight. The wife came to a place where her husband was praying by himself. She had rent her garments and let down her hair. Their children were with her, and she carried in her hands a little girl who was still at the breast. She placed her at the feet of her unknowing husband, while she herself embraced his knees with her arms, and hissed with the voice of a snake, "Take pity on me, my sweetest, and on yourself as well. Take pity on the children we share, whom you see over here. Those whom descend from our stock has made renowned should not be allowed to become slaves, and I should not be subject to an unworthy and shameful marriage while my husband is alive. I, who have always thought myself fortunate among those of my age because of my Saturus. God knows that you will have done against your will something which others may well have done voluntarily." That Job answered her with the voice of a saint, "You are speaking just as one of the foolish women. I would be afraid, woman, if the bitter sweetness of this life were the only thing. You are the servant, wife, of the cunning of the devil. If you loved your spouse, you would never entice your husband to a second death. Let them sell the children. Let them take my wife from me. Let them carry away all my wealth. Trusting in his promises, I shall hold fast to the words of my Lord. If anyone does not give up his wife, children, fields, or house, he cannot be my disciple." Why say more? His wife rebutted, went away with the children, and Saturus was strengthened to receive his crown. He was examined, lost his property, was wearied by punishments, and sent away a beggar, forbidden to appear in public. They took everything from him, but they were not able to carry off the stole of baptism. After these things, Geisiric ordered that the church of Carthage was to be closed, and its priests and junior clergy scattered and dispersed to different places of exile, because there was no bishop. Thanks to this application the ruler Zeno made through the patrician Severus, it was with difficulty opened again, and so they all returned from exile. What he did in Spain, Italy, Dalmatia, Campania, Calabria, Apulia, Sicily, Sardinia, Bruttium, Lucania, old Epirus and Greece, those who suffered there things which are to be lamented, will better tell. But let this now be the end of the persecution waged against us by Geisiric, with as much pride as cruelty. His reign lasted for 37 years and 3 months.